Did the Founding Fathers get this wrong? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. That's it. That is the entire First Amendment. One sentence. 4 freedoms. Well, technically 5, if you count the ability to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Meaning you can sue the government if they infringe upon any of these. And hundreds of years later, thousands of pages of legal doctrine have issued from that First Amendment. We were all taught about the First Amendment in school, at some point in your formal education. But not all of us had the desire or access to attend law school and study the First Amendment closely. That is where I come in. I attended law school and hated most of it. The main thing that I learned in law school was that it was a haven for bro culture and reciprocity. You know, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's kind of like how corporate America works today. Hi, I'm Jenny, and I'm the nerd who went to civics camp when I was young and went on to minor in public service in undergraduate college. I graduated from law school about a lifetime ago, or 20 years thereabouts, take your pick, and my favorite classes involved constitutional law. I even wrote a brief that was heard before the Supreme Court, but I didn't love law school. So even though I didn't pursue a career in law, my legal education has stayed with me for over 20 years now, and I can share my knowledge with you. In the words of the Indigo Girls, I got my paper and I was free. Disclaimers I need to include here include, this is not legal advice. You cannot construe anything that I say here today as legal advice. It simply isn't. Nor will you be able to pass your Con Law 1 exam for those of you who are still in law school. In this series, we'll be taking a close look at the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. What it is, who it's meant to protect, how we got to where we are today, and why, today of all days, here in 2025, it is in jeopardy. We will also discuss what you, yes you, can do about it, both immediately after this video and in the long term. The goal of this series is to take a closer look at the First Amendment, putting it into terms that everyone can understand, not just lawyers and antiquated old white dudes with robes and wigs. So, what is the First Amendment? Again, the entire text of it: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of people to peacefully assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Sorry if that felt a little repetitive. I thought it was important enough to read again. So the basic structure of it is there are 4 protected things within the First Amendment. Freedom of religion, and that includes both the Establishment Clause and the Separation Clause. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. We'll be taking a look at each one of these in depth in other videos in the series. So here's how the Constitution is structured. The basis of the Constitution, before we get to any amendments, basically sets up the core, the structure of our government. Now I'll briefly take you through the basis of the Constitution and the structure of it. Article 1 establishes the legislative branch, setting up both houses of Congress and defining it and its powers. Article 2 sets the structure of the executive branch and explicitly states the power of the president. This is where the Emoluments Clause is, the one that prevents the president from making a profit off of, being president. Trump wasn't the first to violate it, but he certainly has been the most egregious and flagrant violator of the Emoluments Clause. And more importantly, he typically has the support of Congress to not look further into the matter, especially in 2025, when he has been consolidating power from the other two branches of government that were set up in the Constitution. But we aren't here today to look at the articles of the Constitution. We are focusing on the First Amendment. So without further ado, I do want to go through the articles of the Constitution and, kind of because they're the framework for what follows, which is the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which is also not to say that the other 17 amendments aren't important, because they are. Article 3 establishes the judiciary branch of government and establishes the Supreme Court. It also lets Congress establish lower courts, which has evolved today into our federal judiciary system. Note, it does not specify anywhere in Article 3 of the Constitution the number of justices that are required to be on the court. Currently, we have 9, and as we'll get to in a little bit, the Supreme Court is kind of the law of the land. Article 4 is the full faith and credit clause, and that gives power to the states, but the dormant commerce clause within that regulates those powers. This article also confers the ability to conduct interstate commerce, such as sales of goods across state lines. Article 5 is the ability of Congress to amend the U.S. Constitution. Article 6 basically extends the Articles of Confederation, which is a document that preceded the U.S. Constitution. It extends those Articles of Confederation into the Constitution. An interesting note is that every member of the federal government must be sworn in under oath, but swearing in under a religious test should never be required in order to serve in the government. This is pretty much the only place in the Constitution that mentions religion outside of the First Amendment. Article 6 also contains a supremacy clause, which states that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land and supersedes states' rights. I find it very interesting that in 2025, when we are talking about returning power to the states and a lot of the executive orders that are coming out of the executive branch right now are trying to confer power back to the states over especially controversial legal matters like abortion, like LGBTQIA plus rights, etc. Article 7 covers the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, and it only required that 9 of the 13 original states concur in order to for the U.S. Constitution to be ratified. In case you need a refresher, ratified just means that it has been adopted as law. It is, the current supreme law of the land. It took 9 of the 13 states to agree that this Constitution and this version of the Constitution was the one that would set up the U.S. government structure. Now, there were 10 amendments issued almost immediately after the U.S. Constitution was adopted. We know these as the Bill of Rights, and it takes quite a bit in today's climate especially to amend the Constitution. That is by design. There are 27 amendments in total currently as of 2025, and the most recent one was added in 1992. Before that, I want to say it was like circa end of World War II era. So it takes a lot to change the U.S. Constitution, especially in the current political climate. In this series, we will be discussing only the First Amendment of those first 10 amendments. Most of us are familiar with the First, Second, Fifth, maybe the 14th amendments, but the First, Second, and Fifth out of the Bill of Rights. Every other of the other 26 amendments is also very important, and every single one of them is at risk currently, as is, unfortunately, the entire Constitution in 2025. So now that we've discussed the structure of the Constitution, let's take a look at some of the other questions, like who the Constitution applies to, and more importantly, why certain people have been excluded under the protections of the Constitution. Yes, MAGA, slavery really was that bad. I can't believe we're having this conversation in 2025. Let's also take a look at how the Constitution is applied in real life and take a look at why you should care when your First Amendment rights are threatened. Let's also look at some real life contemporaneous examples of how your rights are in question today, right now. On paper, the U.S. Constitution applies to every U.S. citizen. Except it didn't. The Founding Fathers explicitly excluded enslaved people, women, and poor white men. Basically, you had to be rich, white, and own land in order to be protected by the Constitution, as it was written. Eventually, all that changed, and the formerly enslaved, and eventually women, were given the right to vote, but not until the Constitution was nearly 100 years old. And in the case of black women, it was nearly 200 years old. So the Constitution is where white supremacy is enshrined on paper. Even though eventually other people besides white landowning men were afforded protection under the Constitution, the damage had been done. I don't know about you, but as a young white girl in a middle-class, politically active family, I grew up with a strong reverence of the Constitution. Although I never loved that it was initially never meant to protect me. There are also several protected classes under the U.S. Constitution as it has evolved through case law over the years, almost 250 years. And under those, the amount of discrimination allowed varies from class to class, and there are varying tests to see what constitutes discrimination. But those all don't make an appearance until the 14th Amendment, which is outside of the scope of this video and this video series. So, how did we get to where we are today? It's kind of weird, but the U.S. Constitution is applied to daily life through case law. From Marbury versus Madison, if you remember that from high school history class, to other cases like Roe versus Wade, Brown versus Board of Education, even Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe. Obergefell versus Hodges, which is the case that established gay right to marriage. We'll get to both Roe and Dobbs here in a bit. And with the Supreme Court looking to overturn Obergefell versus Hodges in the next upcoming term, the Constitution affects all of us every day in nearly every way. This is why I don't understand people who don't have, who don't think that they are allowed to have strong opinions about politics, or people who shun political conversations because they don't know enough, or everything is so political these days. Well, Karen, yes, everything is political. To quote one of my favorite Ohio politicians, Nina Turner, "You don't do politics? Well, baby, politics is going to do you regardless." So, how do First Amendment lawsuits work? Someone sues someone else, claiming that their First Amendment rights have been violated. The case may or may not be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court does hear that case, they then decide on that case, either for or against the person who brought the lawsuit. If it makes it to the Supreme Court, the 9 justices, again, the number is not required by the Constitution, and it's varied over the years. Those 9 justices will decide whether legal precedent, aka a case, has already been decided, and whether that previous legal precedent should apply or should be reconsidered. Then, and this is where your rights are really strongly currently at risk, Congress needs to codify that decision into law. This is how Roe got overturned. Remember the wording of the First Amendment? Congress shall, not the Supreme Court, Congress shall. If they don't enshrine the outcome of that decision into law, that ruling can be reconsidered later. We've seen this with Roe versus Wade being overturned by Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. In this upcoming session, we're expected to see this iteration of the Supreme Court reconsider Obergefell versus Hodges, meaning that the right to gay marriage may be gone. I'm not trying to fearmonger here. but these are truly terrifying times that we are living in. So, originalists are people who want to follow the original letter of the law within the Constitution, and the current Supreme Court composition includes several originalists. They didn't actually appear until the 1970s and 1980s, and now they are a supermajority on the Supreme Court. Instead of interpreting the Constitution as it was originally intended to be this malleable, dynamic document and structure of government, they want to constantly amend it to suit their needs. I mean, theoretically, the court should consider varying legal theories whenever they reconsider a case and the law that was decided behind it. Case law is what currently governs our country, and that can be both good and bad. Certainly, the Founding Fathers wanted the U.S. Constitution to be a dynamic document, able to change with the times. And it has. Certain compositions of the court have made some really landmark decisions. With the current composition of the court, however, and the grab for power by the executive branch, I'm not convinced that this is exactly what the Founding Fathers wanted. We've all heard of it before. But my rights! What are your rights? Are they explicitly covered by the Constitution? And what can we do about it? Remember, the First Amendment clearly specifies that Congress shall not infringe upon freedom of speech, establish a religion, or prohibit the free exercise thereof, and shall not infringe upon the right to peacefully assemble or freedom of the press. They don't say anything about what the Supreme Court can decide. And as Jon Stewart said earlier this week, we use the Supreme Court as a crutch because the Constitution is so hard to amend. And he was absolutely correct in that statement. So what can you do? Contact your representatives as many times as it takes for them to hear you. Stay on it daily if you need. Keep on them until you get through to them. Remember, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Or, as my mother once told me, if you're mad about it, do something about it. Don't just sit there in your anger. Do something about it. And Mom, I'm mad. We'll discuss more of that in a later episode. In the meantime, vote in every election, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem. Vote like your life depends on it, because it literally does. Voting rights go hand in hand with freedom of speech and your First Amendment rights. But Jen, both parties are equally corrupt. Okay, whatever there. But one party is not actively trying to make it nearly impossible for anyone except white landowning men to vote once again today. One party is hell-bent on restricting the right to vote and putting it under the guise of electoral integrity. Yes, even in 2025. The amount of MAGA women that I have seen in recent years calling for women to lose the right to vote boggles my mind. Every accusation is a confession. So, how do we heal from this? Indulge in some self-care. Buy yourself a nice candle, if that's your thing. Buy yourself a nice bath bomb, if that's your thing. They don't have to be my products, but you deserve nice things. Take care of your mental health. Indulge in some self-care, whatever that looks like for you. Do something that soothes your soul, that nourishes your spirit. And fucking vote next month, no matter how seemingly insignificant or unimportant the issues on your particular ballot seem. Now you may be wondering, how did I go from law school to owning my own company that makes bath and body products from scratch? And it's because I also was freaking out. I started my company in 2018. We're actually about to have my 7th anniversary here. And I saw that people needed some soul soothing. People needed some reassurance. We were all freaking out. This is kind of my way of reassuring you. It's going to be all right. We're going to get through this. Until next week, I'm Jen. Thanks for joining me. And don't forget, we still haven't seen the full Epstein files.